Hey everybody, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about consumer and producer surplus, what that means, and then what happens to it when the government starts to interfere with the price controls or other government interventions. So first of all, we've already talked about supply and demand, so we kind of understand that, supply and demand, and there's an equilibrium point, and the equilibrium determines the price and quantity. So for every consumer that is purchasing goods at the equilibrium price or at whatever price they're paying, there's a difference between the price they pay and the maximum they would have been willing to pay. We often refer to that as the value, right? The value that a consumer places on a good is the maximum that they're willing to pay for that good. And you need to start thinking of your demand line as representing value, right? So if you were to look at your demand curve, right, we know that the price is down here at equilibrium. That's the price that you're going to pay. But if you're, let's say, this consumer, well, there's somebody who was willing to pay more, right? Let's say, for example, the equilibrium price is $10. There was somebody who was willing to pay $15, right? Well, the difference between the price you're willing to pay, the maximum, and the price you actually pay is called consumer surplus. It's basically the total benefit that you get at the current price. So again, if you're willing to pay 15, but you get to pay 10, your consumer surplus is 5, right? The difference. And if you were to take every single consumer, you would end up with this entire area. This entire area represents the total consumer's surplus at the equilibrium point. Now, graphically, there's a trick to know, and later on it's going to matter when we start to solve questions where we start to modify the situation and we start to mess with the equilibrium. It's always important to be able to identify where your consumer's surplus is. And it is the area that is below demand, above price, and to the left of the quantity that consumers are purchasing. So in this case, at equilibrium, it ends up being this top half of this top triangle, basically the area that is above the equilibrium point. But before we get into that, it's really important to just wrap your heads around what I said. The consumer surplus is simply the difference between the maximum you were willing to pay and the actual price you pay. And if you took every single consumer and you added up their consumer surplus, you would get the total consumer surplus. Then you have producer surplus. So for producers, it's a little bit different, but very much the same. Producers have a cost. Think of the supply line as representing cost. And the cost is the minimum that a producer would accept for the good. Because below that, they would lose money, right? And every point along the supply curve represents a cost. But again, the suppliers are selling the good for the equilibrium price. The producer surplus is the difference between what the producer actually receives, so the price, and the minimum they would have accepted or their cost. So let's say this unit right here, maybe this producer only has a cost of $2. Or maybe the minimum they were willing to accept was $2, but they get to sell it for $10 because that's the price. Well, they have a surplus of $8. And again, if you took every single producer, the producer surplus would end up being this entire bottom half or this entire blue triangle. But again, just simply, it's the difference between the price they get and the minimum they would have accepted. Now, when you put the two together, you get something called economic surplus, total economic surplus. It's just the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus. And when the government starts to be involved, you would also include in that any benefit to the government. Okay, we'll deal with the government stuff in a second. For now, we're just going through kind of the basics of what consumer surplus and producer surplus is. The total economic surplus, right, so the sum of both, is always maximized at equilibrium. So we say that the equilibrium point is the efficient point. Any point other than the equilibrium is inefficient. It's inefficient because the total benefit to society is no longer maximized. Remember, at the equilibrium point, we are maximizing the total economic surplus, the total economic benefit to the entire society. But once we start to have things like price controls where the government interferes and they say, oh, we want to modify the price, we want to impose a tax, we want to do whatever, then you start to decrease the total economic surplus. And there's a name for the loss of economic surplus, and that's called deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss is basically the total loss of economic surplus as a result of a government intervention. So I've given you an example here of a price floor. We'll get into the details of a price floor in a second. But you see here that when the government imposed this price floor, the consumer surplus and producer surplus changed, right? They went from being this to being this. Well, this red portion was completely lost, completely eliminated. It was part of the economic surplus at equilibrium. It is no longer part of the economic surplus now, so we call that a deadweight loss. And this long formula here, don't overthink the formula. It just kind of captures how you would calculate deadweight loss, like what deadweight loss is. So deadweight loss is any changes to consumer surplus plus any changes to producer surplus plus any cost to the government minus any government revenues. So if you don't have a government cost or if you don't have a government revenue, you can kind of ignore those parts at the end. Those are for specific situations where the government actually gets involved. Okay. Again, we'll come back to that. Don't worry about that just yet. And a little bit of theory here, and we're going to relate this back to elasticities. The steeper your lines are, and we learned that a steeper line means that something is more inelastic, right? So the steeper the demand curve or the steeper the supply curve, the larger the surplus is, right? Try and imagine, if I go back to my equilibrium point right here, imagine I made my demand curve steeper, okay? So let's say like this. Look how much bigger this area would be, right? The area below demand above price. It would include that entire space. And the steeper you make your line, the larger that triangle. Same thing with supply, right? If you make supply steeper, well, then the surplus expands as well, okay? So it's just something to know that the more inelastic the demand or the supply, the larger the surpluses are, both producers and consumers. Okay. This lesson is mainly about being able to calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus, and then knowing how different price controls or government interventions will go and affect that. So you have several price controls that you need to know. Today we're going to talk about price floors, price ceilings, production quotas, and taxes. So let's start with the price floor. A price floor is a minimum price. So the government feels as though the equilibrium price is too low and forces the price to be higher. First of all, in order for a price floor to even work, it needs to be set above the equilibrium. A price floor set below the equilibrium would have no effect. The market would just stay at equilibrium. But a binding or an effective price floor is one that is set above the equilibrium and prevents the market from returning to the equilibrium point. Now, what are the effects? The effects are that, first of all, the price is higher, obviously, and because the price is higher, the quantity will be lower, right? Consumers are not willing to buy as much anymore because the price is higher. So you can see in the graph here that by forcing the price to be higher, the quantity decreases from Q1, which is the equilibrium, to Q2. And as a result, you see that the consumer surplus gets smaller. The producer's surplus could get smaller or larger, it really depends, and then you have a deadweight loss. So this is all kind of summarized here. The consumers are always worse off as a result of a price floor because they're paying more and they're getting less. Producers can be better off, but they can also be worse off. That really depends on the elasticity. So if supply is very steep or very flat, that will affect whether or not producers are better or worse off. So we're going to learn how to actually calculate this, right? I don't want you to have to look at it and eyeball it. You have to be able to calculate what is the producer surplus before and after to tell me if they're actually better off. So we'll start with that. Instead of running through each one, okay, we're going to do one at a time. So let's start. You can meet me over here at this exercise. So in the market for widgets, the demand function is this. So we've given you a demand curve, and the supply function is that. What is the equilibrium price and quantity, and what is the consumers and producer surplus at equilibrium? So let's start by finding the equilibrium. All right, so by now we know how to do this. We're going to set the two equal to each other. So supply equals demand. And we're going to basically solve this. So your quantity ends up being 80 divided by 0.35, which is 228.57. And then price, if I plug that back into one of them, let's say I plug it into supply here. Again, I'm rounding to 2 decimal places. Feel free to use more. Price ends up being 42.86. Okay, so that's your equilibrium price and quantity. Perfect. Now, as far as consumers and producer surplus, for this, you're going to need to sketch your graph. And so we need, first of all, to sketch the demand curve. So if you take your demand curve and plug in quantity as 0, you're going to get the y-intercept. So you plug in your quantity as 0, you're going to get 100. So you know your y-intercept up here is 100, right? This is price and this is quantity. And you know that it slopes downwards. And you know that it's going to cross the point 228 and 42.86, right? So if 42.86 is roughly here, again, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then we'll say that this point right here is 228.57. Okay, perfect. Then you do the same with supply. Go to your supply curve, which was 20 plus 0.1 Q equals P, and set Q to 0. So 20 plus 0.1 times 0 is 20. So 20 would be roughly there. And this one slopes upwards and crosses that same equilibrium point. So I have my supply and I have my demand. And we know that at equilibrium, the top triangle here is our consumers' surplus. We're going to be looking for that in a second. And the bottom is producers. So it all starts with sketching the graph correctly. It doesn't have to be, again, unless your professor is being specific about like they want everything to be to scale, in which case maybe use a ruler. This is pretty close to being to scale and gives me everything I need. Make sure you have your intercepts. Make sure you correctly calculated your equilibrium. So now the rest is geometry. We have 2 triangles here. For consumers' surplus, remember that a triangle is base times height divided by 2, right? We're looking for the area of that orange triangle. So the base in this case would be 228.57. And the height would be the distance between 100 and 42.86. Okay, so if you do 100 minus 42.86, that is 57.14. So that's my height divided by 2. So 228.57 times 57.14 divided by 2. 6530.24. That is your total consumer surplus at equilibrium. So at this price and quantity, consumers are benefiting $6,530. For producer surplus, you're doing the same thing. Okay, the base is still 228.57. But now your height is this distance between 42.86 and 20, which is 22.86. So base times height divided by 2. The